What if the world's first global war didn't just reshape history, but shattered it? Before Hitler, before Hiroshima, before the Cold War, there was the Great War, World War I, a war that started with a single bullet, but pulled the world into 4 years of trench warfare, gas attacks, collapsing empires, and unimaginable loss. It wasn't fought for land alone. It was fought for pride, power, and the illusion that humanity was too civilized for destruction. That illusion died in the mud of the Western Front. This was not just a conflict. It was a turning point, the first modern war, the first mechanized slaughter. A generation was wiped out, borders redrawn, monarchies erased. Ideologies born from its ashes would burn again in the next global inferno. In this documentary, we take you deep into the war that changed the very soul of the 20th century, the blood, the betrayals, the silence that followed. Backhand Index Point Right subscribe now to History Vault for a journey to the untold truths of World War I. Because if we forget how it started, we risk living through how it ends. It began not with a roar, but with a whisper, a shot fired in a distant corner of Europe, echoing louder than anyone could have imagined. June 28, 1914. Sarajevo, a young Bosnian Serb named Gavrilo Princip pulled a pistol and fired 2 bullets into the carriage of Archduke Franz Ferdinand, heir to the Austro-Hungarian throne. The first struck his wife, Sophie. The second killed the Archduke. And in that moment, the fuse was lit. No one could foresee that the death of a single man would ignite a war that would consume empires, redraw borders, and take the lives of over 20 million souls. But the world was ready, ripe with tension, tangled in alliances and waiting for a spark. Europe in 1914 was a continent on edge. Empires had grown arrogant with power. The British ruled the seas, the French clung to their colonies, the Germans built with ambition, and the Austro-Hungarians simmered with internal unrest. Russia, vast and chaotic, waited for an excuse to act, while the Ottoman Empire teetered toward collapse. Beneath this fragile balance ran deep currents: nationalism, militarism, competition for territory, and above all, a complex web of treaties and secret alliances that ensured any conflict between 2 nations could drag in a dozen more. After the assassination, Austria-Hungary, backed by Germany, delivered an ultimatum to Serbia. Serbia agreed to most, but not all, of the demands. It wasn't enough. On July 28th, Austria declared war on Serbia. In response, Russia began mobilizing to defend its Slavic ally. Germany, sensing an opportunity and threat, declared war on Russia and then on France. When German troops violated Belgian neutrality to reach France, Britain entered the war. In the span of a few weeks, what could have been a localized conflict had become a continental war, and soon a global one. Young men from farms, factories, and universities marched out to battle, cheered by crowds and swept up in national pride. They carried letters from sweethearts, laced up fresh boots, and believed they'd be home by Christmas. But they were walking into a nightmare the world had never seen before. The old ways of war, cavalry charges, sabers, and chivalry, were about to be crushed by the machinery of the industrial age. Trenches, barbed wire, machine guns, artillery, and chemical weapons would redefine combat and erase any illusion of glory. On the Western Front, stretching from the North Sea to the Swiss border, a brutal stalemate took hold. After early German advances, the Allies managed to halt the enemy at the River Marne. Both sides dug in. The land between their trenches became known as no man's land, a graveyard of mud, blood, and twisted metal. There were moments of surreal calm. On Christmas Eve in 1914, soldiers from opposing sides emerged from their trenches, exchanged gifts, played football, and sang carols. But the following day, the killing resumed. Life in the trenches was hell. Rats the size of cats fed on corpses. Trench foot rotted soldiers' flesh. The constant shelling shattered minds. Men lived among death, unable to sleep, always listening for the whistle that meant it was time to go over the top. That meant climbing out into no man's land and charging toward the enemy, through barbed wire, into machine gun fire. Thousands died for a few feet of earth. Names like Ypres, the Somme, and Verdun became synonymous with slaughter. At the Battle of the Somme in 1916, over 1 million men were killed or wounded. for a gain of just a few miles. Meanwhile, on the Eastern Front, warfare was more fluid, but no less brutal. Russia, massive in manpower but ill-prepared and poorly led, suffered staggering losses against Germany and Austria-Hungary. The Russian soldiers, many without rifles, charged bravely but hopelessly into death. As the bodies piled up, unrest back home grew louder. Hunger, poverty, and resentment toward the Tsar festered in the hearts of workers and peasants. The seeds of revolution had been sown. In the south, the Ottoman Empire joined the Central Powers, opening new fronts in the Middle East and the Caucasus. The Gallipoli campaign in 1915 saw Allied troops, including many from Australia and New Zealand, attempt to force a way through to Russia. But poor planning, rough terrain, and fierce Turkish resistance led to a bloody failure. Gallipoli became a national tragedy, particularly for the Anzac soldiers, and a defining moment in Turkish resistance under Mustafa Kemal, later known as Ataturk. In Africa and Asia, colonial powers turned their territories into battlefields. African soldiers were drafted into European wars, often without choice, and forced to fight in lands far from home. In India, thousands volunteered for Britain, believing that loyalty might earn them autonomy after the war. Across the oceans, the war's reach stretched far beyond European soil. Technology was rewriting the rules. For the first time, airplanes buzzed overhead, not just for scouting, but dropping bombs. Submarines stalked the seas, with German U-boats targeting Allied shipping. Tanks, slow and clunky, were introduced to break the trench deadlock. And then there was gas, chlorine, phosgene, mustard, released from canisters or fired in shells, burning lungs and blinding eyes, leaving survivors scarred for life. It was not a war of heroism. It was a meat grinder. By the end of 1916, millions were dead, and there was no end in sight. The young men who had once sung as they marched to war now shuffled silently, hollow-eyed and broken. Their letters no longer promised triumph, but begged for peace. But peace was still far away. By the beginning of 1917, the war had become a global graveyard of hope. Millions had died, and yet the front lines barely shifted. Generals drew up plans. Politicians made speeches. But the men in the trenches knew the truth. They were stuck in a war of attrition, a war where victory meant surviving just one more day. The world was bleeding, and the fever wasn't breaking. Then came the tremors of revolution. In Russia, the people's patience had run out. Years of hardship, defeat, and starvation boiled over into unrest. In March 1917, Tsar Nicholas II abdicated, ending more than 300 years of Romanov rule. A provisional government was formed, promising democracy and reform, but it was weak and indecisive. Meanwhile, in the shadows, a new force was rising, one with a bold promise: peace, land, and bread. Led by Vladimir Lenin, the Bolsheviks seized power in the October Revolution. Just months later, the new Soviet regime signed the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk with Germany, withdrawing from the war and ceding vast territory. The Eastern Front collapsed. For Germany, it seemed like a stroke of fortune. With the Russians gone, they could focus their full strength on the Western Front. But it came with risk. As German submarines resumed unrestricted warfare in the Atlantic, sinking any ship bound for Britain, they pushed the United States closer to war. The final blow came in the form of the Zimmermann telegram. In it, Germany secretly proposed a military alliance with Mexico, promising to help it regain lost American territory. The message was intercepted, decoded, and revealed to the public. It was the last straw. On April 6, 1917, the United States of America declared war on Germany. President Woodrow Wilson, a man who had once vowed neutrality, now stood before Congress and declared the world must be made safe for democracy. The American entry into the war brought fresh troops, supplies, and a sense of renewed hope to the exhausted Allies. But it would take time. U.S. forces were still mobilizing. Europe would have to hold on a little longer. On the front, the slaughter continued. In the spring of 1917, British and French forces launched major offensives, hoping to break the deadlock. At Arras and Passchendaele, entire divisions were thrown into mud, rain, and machine gun fire. At the Battle of the Chemin des Dames, French troops charged uphill against entrenched German defenses. The result was catastrophic. Morale crumbled. Thousands of French soldiers mutinied. Some refused to leave their trenches. Others marched with black flags and shouted, "Down with the war." The French High Command responded with executions and silence. But behind the scenes, reforms were made to keep the army from collapsing altogether. As Europe staggered, the war widened. In the Middle East, British officer T. Lawrence of Arabia, helped unite Arab tribes against the Ottoman Empire. They launched raids, sabotaged railways, and captured Damascus. In Palestine, British forces took Jerusalem, ending 4 centuries of Ottoman control. Across Africa, small bands of German troops waged guerrilla campaigns that lasted long after the European armistice. In the Pacific, Japanese forces seized German colonies. It was truly a world war, one fought across oceans, deserts, jungles, and frozen frontiers. Meanwhile, on the home fronts, war consumed everything. Factories were turned to arms production. Women entered the workforce in vast numbers, running transport, ammunition, and hospitals. Rationing became a way of life. Governments expanded powers, censored the press, and used propaganda to keep public morale high. In Britain and Germany alike, posters urged citizens to do their part, even if that meant sending their sons to die. It wasn't just soldiers at the front who paid the price. Entire populations bore the burden. Then, in early 1918, Germany made its final move. With American forces still arriving and the clock ticking, German General Ludendorff launched the Spring Offensive, a massive series of assaults along the Western Front. Using new stormtrooper tactics, they broke through Allied lines, pushing closer to Paris than they had since 1914. Panic spread, but the victory was short-lived. German forces were overstretched, undersupplied, and exhausted. The Allies, bolstered by fresh American troops, counterattacked. The tide had turned. The 100 Days Offensive, beginning in August 1918, was relentless. Allied tanks smashed through German positions. Air superiority tilted to the Allies. Village after village was reclaimed. German morale crumbled. Desertions increased. On the home front, German civilians faced starvation due to the British naval blockade. Protests erupted. Workers struck. Soldiers refused orders. Revolution was in the air. On November 9, 1918, the German Kaiser, Wilhelm II, abdicated and fled to the Netherlands. A republic was proclaimed in Berlin. 2 days later, in a railway carriage in the forest of Compiègne, the Germans signed the armistice. The guns fell silent at 11 a.m. on November 11th. After 4 years, the war was over, but peace would not come easily. The 11th hour of the 11th day of the 11th month, as the guns finally fell silent across Europe, the war that had shattered the world came to an end. But silence did not mean peace. It meant exhaustion, a stunned kind of relief, and beneath that, a quiet grief that stretched from muddy trenches to broken homes. In every village and city, names were missing, brothers, fathers, sons who would never return. The war was over, but its cost had just begun to be counted. In Paris, London, and Washington, crowds cheered and flags waved, but there was also a hollowness in the celebration. Victory came not with triumph, but with a sense that something had been lost forever. For empires had collapsed. The German Empire, the Austro-Hungarian Empire, the Ottoman Empire, and the Russian Empire. Monarchs were gone. Borders had been redrawn. Millions were dead. Millions more were wounded, crippled, or scarred beyond recognition. And a generation of young men, raised in the belief of honor and country, had marched into a war of machines and been devoured. Now the victors faced a daunting question. How do you rebuild a world so completely broken? In early 1919, leaders from the Allied powers gathered in Paris to decide the terms of peace. Woodrow Wilson came with his 14 points, a vision of a world guided by diplomacy, national self-determination, and a League of Nations to prevent future conflict. But the reality on the ground was different. France, having borne the brunt of the Western Front, demanded justice. Britain sought to preserve its empire. Italy hoped for territorial rewards. And Germany, though defeated, still stood tall, its land untouched by foreign troops. Many feared it would rise again. The Treaty of Versailles, signed on June 28, 1919, exactly 5 years after the assassination that sparked the war, was intended to bring closure. Instead, it sowed the seeds of future chaos. Germany was forced to accept full responsibility for the war, pay massive reparations, cede territory, and disband much of its military. The humiliation burned deep. German citizens called it a diktat, a dictated peace. One young veteran, seething with resentment, would later write in his book that this treaty was a betrayal that would one day be avenged. His name was Adolf Hitler. Elsewhere, the pieces of fallen empires were reshaped into new nations. Austria-Hungary fractured into Austria, Hungary, Czechoslovakia, and Yugoslavia. The Ottoman Empire crumbled, and in its ruins rose mandates governed by Britain and France. Syria and Lebanon went to French. Palestine, Iraq, and Transjordan fell under British control. In theory, they were being prepared for independence. In reality, they were being carved up by colonial interests. Betrayals ran deep. The Arabs, who had fought alongside the Allies with hopes of freedom, found themselves under foreign rule once again. In Russia, peace had no meaning. The Bolshevik Revolution had sparked a civil war. The Red Army, led by Lenin's new regime, fought the Whites, an alliance of monarchist conservatives and foreign powers. The fighting was brutal, and in 1918, the Romanov family, Tsar Nicholas II, his wife, and 5 children, were executed by Bolshevik guards in a dark basement in Ekaterinburg. Russia, vast and wounded, withdrew from the world stage, locked in a new ideological war that would eventually birth the Soviet Union. In Germany, the war's end did not bring stability. The Weimar Republic, created in the ashes of the monarchy, was born under siege of inflation, political extremism, and national shame. Communists clashed with right-wing militias. Assassinations and uprisings rocked the cities. A fragile democracy tried to hold the line, but many longed for strong leadership, someone to restore pride and order. The soil was fertile for radicalism. But amid the ruins, there were also moments of change and hope. Women, who had stepped into factories and offices during the war, now demanded recognition. In Britain, the United States, and other countries, women gained the right to vote. New movements in art, literature, and philosophy emerged from the trauma. Writers like Eric Maria Remarque and Wilfred Owen captured the disillusionment of a generation. Pain became poetry. The old world had died, and something raw and uncertain was being born. Veterans returned home not to parades, but to silence. Many were haunted by memories they could not share. Shell shock, what we now call PTSD, was poorly understood. Men who had survived gas attacks, trench bombardments, and the screams of dying comrades found it harder to survive peacetime. Some wandered, some drank, some never spoke of the war again. In cemeteries across Europe, rows of white crosses marked lives cut short. And in many towns, monuments were raised not to glorify, but to mourn. The League of Nations, Wilson's great hope, was created to ensure that such a war would never happen again. But the United States, gripped by isolationist sentiment, never joined. The League lacked power. It could pass resolutions, but not enforce them. It was a symbol of hope, but not a shield against aggression. Economically, the world reeled. Europe was in debt. The war had drained treasuries and disrupted trade. In Germany, inflation would soon spiral out of control. Banknotes lost value by the hour. People carried cash in wheelbarrows and burned it for warmth. Desperation fed anger. Anger searched for someone to blame. And so, the so-called war end all wars did not end war at all. It left wounds that never healed. It created borders that fueled ethnic tensions for decades. It shattered faith in old institutions. And while it ended with signatures on paper and parades in the streets, it left behind a ticking clock, a countdown to a second, even greater catastrophe. But in that moment, in 1919, the world still believed that it had endured the worst, believed that the future would be brighter, believed that peace had a chance. They didn't know what was coming. The war had ended, but the world it left behind was anything but peaceful. From the shattered cities of Europe to the broken bodies of survivors, from the silent graves of millions to the roaring debates in parliaments, Something had been torn that could not be mended by treaties or declarations. World War I had unstitched the very fabric of civilization, and now the world wandered directionless. In the aftermath, in the years immediately following the armistice, there was a strange silence across Europe, a shell-shocked calm, a pause that felt uneasy. People tried to return to normal, but what was normal when the old world was gone? Villages once filled with young men, now echoed with the laughter of orphans. Veterans limped through streets in uniforms now too big for their hollow bodies. Fields once golden with wheat still yielded shell casings and bones. In Germany, the bitterness festered. Though the fighting had ended, many Germans felt they had never truly been defeated. The army had not been crushed in the field. Instead, it had been betrayed from within, they claimed. This narrative, the stab-in-the-back myth, began to take hold, pushed by right-wing groups and nationalist leaders. They blamed the Weimar politicians, the communists, and especially the Jews for signing the Treaty of Versailles and humiliating the nation. The economic crisis worsened. In 1923, hyperinflation devastated the German middle class. Bread that once cost a mark now cost millions. Children played with banknotes like paper toys. Families bartered heirlooms for food. A society once proud and industrialized crumbled into despair. Amid the chaos, extremist parties grew stronger. The seeds of something darker were beginning to sprout. Elsewhere, instability reigned. In Italy, economic turmoil and the fear of communism paved the way for Benito Mussolini and his fascist party. He marched on Rome in 1922 and seized power, promising order and national revival. His success would become a model for others. Strong men rising in broken nations, offering pride in exchange for obedience. In Eastern Europe, newly formed nations struggled to define themselves. Czechoslovakia, Poland, Yugoslavia, and others emerged from the ruins of empire, often composed of conflicting ethnic and cultural groups. Borders were drawn hastily, with little regard for history or identity. Friction and violence followed. In Russia, the Bolsheviks consolidated power after a brutal civil war, forming the Soviet Union, a new kind of state ruled by ideology rather than monarchy. Meanwhile, in the Middle East, the collapse of the Ottoman Empire had opened a new chapter of imperial control. Arabs who had fought for independence found themselves under British and French mandates. Promises made during wartime were broken in peacetime. Tension simmered, especially in Palestine, where British control and increased Jewish immigration would soon lead to clashes that echo into the present day. For the United States, the war had been brief but transformative. It emerged stronger, richer, and less entangled in Europe's chaos. In the 1920s, America turned inward. Isolationism became policy. The League of Nations was rejected. The U.S. focused on growth, consumerism, and a new cultural era, the Jazz Age. But beneath the surface, cracks were forming. Wall Street boomed, but not for all. The seeds of the Great Depression had already been sown. Art, literature, and music bore the weight of trauma. A generation of artists, writers, and thinkers rejected the optimism of the 19th century. In its place came disillusionment. The Lost Generation, as they came to be called, chronicled the moral decay and emotional scars left by the war. Hemingway wrote with simplicity and pain. Wilfred Owen, though killed before the war's end, left behind poems filled with haunting honesty. Dulce et decorum est, he wrote, was a lie. The old belief that it was sweet and noble to die for one's country had been shattered in the trenches. Memorials rose in every country. Tombs of the unknown soldier, eternal flames, towering statues. But they could not replace the dead. They were symbols, reminders, often wrapped in national pride, but also in quiet mourning. Families visited names etched in stone, names without bodies. Entire towns in France and Belgium were never rebuilt. They remained frozen in ruin, war memorials in themselves. For those who survived, survival came at a cost. Many were physically maimed, lost limbs, damaged lungs, scarred faces. Others bore invisible wounds. Shell shock, then poorly understood, left thousands unable to function in daily life. Hospitals filled with men who flinched at loud sounds or couldn't speak at all. Society struggled to understand them. Some were shunned, others forgotten. The 1920s saw flickers of hope, a decade of recovery, of music, movement, and invention. But it was built on fragile ground. Nationalism was not dead. Militaries were rebuilding. And the economic systems propping up the global order were unstable. When the stock market crashed in 1929, the shock was global. The Great Depression began. And in Germany, suffering once again, the people turned to new voices, ones that promised to restore honor, rebuild strength, and erase the shame of Versailles. The war had ended, but its story was not over. Its legacy lived on, not just in politics and borders, but in hearts and minds. The way people viewed war had changed forever. The romance of glory had been replaced by the reality of mud, blood, and broken promises. World War I had shown what modern warfare truly meant. And yet, it had not been enough to prevent what was coming. In classrooms, children learned about the war as a lesson. In cafes, veterans sat in silence, remembering friends who never returned. In government halls, leaders made speeches about peace. But few realized that peace was no longer simply the absence of war. It was something to be protected, built, defended, not just by treaties, but by truth. And in the quiet corners of the world, a storm was gathering again. The echoes of World War I did not fade with time. They grew louder, reverberating through the years like aftershocks of an earthquake. Though the guns had gone silent in 1918, the world never truly returned to peace. What had begun as a war of empires ended as a war of ideas, and the landscape of the 20th century was forever shaped by its aftermath. The war had not only redrawn borders, it had redrawn minds. From the moment the treaties were signed, the question was not just how to rebuild, but how to remember. Was this war a warning, a failure, a necessary sacrifice? For some, it was a noble cause, fighting for freedom, for homeland, for honor. For others, it was a pointless slaughter, a betrayal of youth by the old, of ideals by greed. The debate would rage in books, classrooms, and living rooms for generations. And in those debates lay the foundation for how humanity would prepare, or fail to prepare, for the storms ahead. The interwar years were not a time of healing, but a time of tension masked by brief prosperity. Economies grew in the 1920s, only to collapse by the end of the decade. Democracies wavered. Extremism surged. In Italy, Mussolini's fascism took root. In Germany, Hitler's Nazi Party moved from fringe to forefront. Their rise was not in spite of the First World War. It was because of it. The pain, the poverty, the humiliation of Versailles, the desperate search for identity, all became fuel for fire that had never been fully extinguished. But even as darkness gathered, there were voices that spoke of hope. Organizations like the League of Nations, though flawed, represented an attempt to prevent another catastrophe. Artists and writers continued to expose the horrors of the trenches, warning of what could come. And yet, the lessons of World War I were often misunderstood, or worse, ignored. In many nations, especially Britain and France, the memory of the war created a deep aversion to conflict. Politicians feared another mass slaughter, and the public demanded peace at almost any cost. This mindset led to policies of appeasement when new aggressors rose in the 1930s. The trauma of World War I became a trap, one that made it harder to confront the new threats that loomed. But perhaps the deepest legacy of the Great War lay in the way it transformed the very idea of humanity's progress. Before 1914, many believed in inevitable advancement, that science, technology, and culture would carry civilization forward. But the war had weaponized technology. It had turned poetry into propaganda. It had shown that progress would be reversed and that barbarism could return in modern form. Trenches and gas masks replaced dreams of utopia. Still, amid the darkness, seeds of resilience were sown. Women, who had proven their strength during the war, continued to push for equality. In many countries, suffrage movements gained momentum, leading to real political change. In medicine, the urgency of war had led to advances in surgery, prosthetics, and trauma care. In aviation, crewed warplanes became the basis for a future that would one day connect the world. World War I also forced a reckoning with memory itself. Memorials were not just monuments. They were tools for nations to process grief. The tomb of the unknown soldier, first unveiled in 1920, became a universal symbol of all those lost without name, without trace. The red poppy, born from the battlefield of Flanders, became a silent tribute worn every November. Even silence became sacred. 2 minutes at the 11th hour, honoring not just victory, but the cost. But remembrance was not uniform. In Germany, where the war had ended in defeat and shame, memory became a battlefield of its own. Competing narratives fought for control. Some sought to honor the fallen and rebuild peace. Others stoked resentment and revenge. It was in this fractured memory that dangerous ideologies found fertile ground. History, when distorted, becomes a weapon. And that weapon was already being sharpened. By the 1930s, the storm clouds were unmistakable. Japan invaded Manchuria. Italy attacked Ethiopia. Germany rearmed in violation of Versailles. And Hitler began speaking of a greater Germany, a purified people and a reckoning to come. The world watched and hesitated. They remembered the horrors of World War I, but not always the reasons behind them. And in that hesitation, history began to repeat itself. In many ways, World War I was not just a war, it was a door to a new century, to new ideologies, to new ways of war. It was a test of modern civilization, and one that modern civilization failed. It proved that even in an age of enlightenment, man was still capable of madness, that nationalism, when unchecked, could destroy empires, that alliances, when rigid, could spark global infernos, that silence, in the face of injustice, was its own kind of violence. Yet it also revealed something else. Amid the horror, there was also heroism. Amid the collapse, courage. In the mud and smoke, men and women discovered reserves of strength, compassion, and endurance. They wrote letters. They saved comrades. They resisted tyranny. They hoped, and hope, though battered, never died. World War I taught us that peace is not the default. It is a prize. It is earned through vigilance, through understanding, and through remembrance. That is why the war must not be forgotten, not for the glory, but for the warning, not for the victories, but for the silence that followed. Now, more than a century later, the war's final survivors are gone, but their stories remain in diaries and photographs, in the lines carved into stone. And as long as we tell them, as long as we listen, the lessons of that terrible war still live. Because history is not just what we remember, it's what we choose to carry forward. When the last soldier fell and the armistice silenced the guns, the world stood changed, but not healed. World War I didn't just end a chapter of history. It began a new, uncertain era, one still echoing today. It birthed revolutions, dictatorships, and borders still contested. It taught the world how to kill more efficiently, and failed to teach how to stop. But among the ruins were lessons. That piece isn't inherited. It's built, that the cost of pride is paid in lives, and that the scars of war are not just physical, they're generational. In the cemeteries of Europe, in the forgotten towns of the Middle East, in the stories passed down from trench to tombstone, World War I lives on. It demands remembrance, not for nostalgia, but for warning. Pushpin of this journey has opened your eyes to the roots of modern history. Don't let the story end here. Backhand index pointing right like. Share and comment with your thoughts. Television subscribe to History Vault for more powerful historical deep dives. Because the past isn't past. It's a mirror. And when the world seems to forget, we remember.